All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everyone has coffee. I'm going to start this morning by just giving a rundown of recent regulatory developments and risk mitigation strategies in the cannabis, CBD, and hemp sectors. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gerard Olson. I'm the Associate General Counsel at LegitScript. Among other things, I help set our internal CBD and cannabis policies. For anyone who's unfamiliar, LegitScript's mission, in short, is to make the internet and payment ecosystems safer and more transparent. We do this by working with major players in e-commerce and payments to keep their portfolios free of bad actors. We partner with government agencies like the FDA and the MHLW in Japan. We offer a handful of certification services as well for businesses like pharmacies, addiction treatment providers, CBD merchants, to demonstrate that they follow our strict compliance standards. So I'm sure everyone here is aware of the massive growth in the cannabis market that was just covered in the last session. Unfortunately, with this growth, there comes considerable risk. There's opportunistic bad actors, unclear and rapidly changing regulations, spotty enforcement. So today I'm just going to attempt to walk you through some of the ins and outs of the recent regulatory changes in the space and give you some tips on what you can do to mitigate your risk as this industry tries to lurch into the mainstream. So to understand the current landscape, I always find it helpful to do just a quick refresher on basic terminology. This might be a little rudimentary for some of you, but I always find it helpful to make sure everyone's on the same page because it can get complicated pretty quickly. So to start, cannabis, it's a term that's basically the blanket term for all parts of the cannabis sativa plant. It basically encompasses both hemp and marijuana. Both hemp and marijuana are cultivars of the cannabis sativa plant. While there can be differences in terms of appearance and application, for example, hemp can be used for a wide variety of applications, such as in paper, textiles, biofuel, food as a source of CBD, whereas marijuana is primarily used as it's cultivated primarily for its psychoactive purposes. The main difference really here is just a legal one. Under the law, hemp is defined basically as any cannabis plant or cannabis plant derivative that contains less than 0.3% delta-9 THC, which is the primary psychoactive substance in cannabis. Marijuana, on the other hand, is any cannabis plant or derivative that contains more than 0.3% delta-9 THC, and that is a Schedule I controlled substance federally. Now, CBD, just like THC, it's a cannabinoid that can be found in both marijuana and hemp. Unlike THC, however, it doesn't have much of a psychoactive effect. Instead, it's primarily marketed for its therapeutic uses. Now, there's not currently a lot of compelling clinical evidence to support a lot of these uses, but there is one product that is called Epidiolex. It's basically gone through the clinical trials and was able to get FDA approved as a drug for the treatment of 2 rare forms of childhood epilepsy. And recently, it was approved for treatment of a disease called tuberous sclerosis complex. Now, Epidiolex, it was first approved by the FDA back in July 2018. This was really one of the first recent steps that moved the needle towards a more legitimate market for CBD. At the time, hemp and marijuana were basically legally considered the same thing. There was no 0.3% THC threshold. Basically, any and all cannabis plants or their derivatives, with a couple minor exceptions, were considered Schedule I substances. This changed in December 2018 with the signing of the 2018 Farm Bill, which officially removed hemp from the purview of the Controlled Substances Act and created this distinction between hemp and marijuana. And this really opened the floodgates. Up to this point, almost all CBD on the market was arguably a controlled substance, and the 2018 Farm Bill changed this almost overnight. This should have been a huge win for the CBD and hemp industries, and it really was, but it was dampened a bit by another provision in the Farm Bill that explicitly preserved the FDA's authority to regulate many CBD products. Now, for years, the FDA maintained that CBD is an impermissible ingredient in food and dietary supplements. This is due to a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, known as the IND preclusion. And this provision basically says that if an ingredient is used in either an FDA-approved drug or in an investigational drug that has well-publicized and substantial clinical studies, it cannot be used in dietary supplements or food. The FDA found that this was the case for Epidiolex, so they determined that it could not be used in dietary supplements or food. And almost immediately after the Farm Bill was signed into law, the FDA issued a statement basically reiterating this position. Thanks to pressure from Congress and the CBD industry in general, the FDA's started considering potentially exempting some forms of CBD from the IND preclusion. At the end of May 2019, they held their first rulemaking hearing on this. They had over 100 speakers. Over 4,500 comments have been submitted to the rulemaking docket at this point. But the FDA has continued to take a fairly aggressive stance on CBD. It seems possible that we may get additional guidance sometime this year or early next year, but at this point they continue to take a fairly aggressive stance. Another thing that the 2018 Farm Bill did, it tasked the USDA with implementing cultivation programs for hemp. So in short, the program permits states and tribal governments to develop their own programs so long as they follow USDA requirements and their plans are approved by the agency. In October 2019, the USDA issued interim rules establishing the requirements for the state and tribal plans. And these rules include things like licensing requirements, testing, sampling, reporting, destruction of non-compliant plants. Stakeholders in several industries have sort of bristled at these interim rules. They find them overly burdensome, difficult to implement, but nonetheless, the agencies approved about 20 state plans and around 30 tribal plans. So just to cover a couple basic FAQs here, as I said, dietary supplements cannot contain CBD. The FDA maintains that it's illegal actually to do so, and they've taken a firm stance on this. They've repeatedly issued warning letters to manufacturers selling CBD in supplements or foods. They may eventually change their stance, but at this point it's considered impermissible under the law. So then what about cosmetics? Well, the answer here is that it's generally okay. This is due in part to the fact that cosmetic regulations are relatively pretty lax compared to food or supplement regulations. There's no similar provision to the IND preclusion provision. And the FDA has basically conceded that while there are certain ingredients that are prohibited in cosmetics, CBD and other cannabis products are not. But one thing you want to watch out for is if a product looks like a cosmetic, but it's claiming to do something other than affect your appearance, you're starting to get into dicey waters there. And that's because CBD, just like any other product, may not be marketed to cure, treat, prevent, or mitigate diseases. The only products that can do this are considered drugs by the FDA, and they're subject to drug approval and manufacturing requirements. The agencies basically stated that CBD products being marketed with claims to treat diseases are really their primary concern, and they frequently issue warning letters against merchants for this issue. And one claim that we see fairly frequently being made by CBD merchants is that the products are legal in all 50 states. If you see this claim, you want to be really wary. A lot of the federal prohibitions against hemp were removed by the 2018 Farm Bill, but states still have primary authority to regulate how hemp and CBD are treated in their borders. So this has sort of resulted in a complicated patchwork. Multiple states impose various restrictions on CBDs. Some are fairly lax, some are a lot more stringent. Louisiana, for example, they basically allow CBD to be sold, but retailers have to obtain a permit. They have to maintain a physical location in the state. They can only sell products that have been approved by the state and which have labels that have been approved by the state. In Hawaii, CBD is basically prohibited in most instances, even in cosmetics. And even states that have fairly robust recreational or medical marijuana programs, they might also impose specific requirements on hemp-derived CBD products. For example, in California, they permit edible CBD products if the CBD has been derived from marijuana or cannabis with THC levels above 0.3%, but if it's derived from hemp, then it cannot be sold in edible form. So all in all, this means there's a lot of potential in this space, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. If you're looking to onboard merchants that are selling CBD, you need to make sure that they're following all federal and state laws. So FDA, FTC, USDA, DEA, state laws, card brand rules. You also want to be really flexible here because the regulations are constantly changing. So you have to be ready to move quickly when new standards come into place. It can really help to partner with companies that are staying abreast of these changes or who are experts in this area. So when we look at these products, there's a handful of core regulatory issues that we frequently come across. First is the quality of the products. You only need to look at the recent headlines to really see what the issues are. While there's a good number of products on the market that are following the rules and which have solid manufacturing practices, there's a huge number of products that are still being created without any oversight. They're not following prescribed manufacturing standards, and they have the potential to be dangerous. Some CBD products have been found to contain pesticides or heavy metals from poor cultivation or production practices. There can be CBD products that are adulterated with other substances, such as synthetic cannabinoids or active pharmaceutical ingredients. And in many cases, the products can either contain too much THC and therefore be controlled substances, or they contain CBD at levels that are wildly different than is on the label. So as I mentioned, because CBD has historically been promoted for its therapeutic uses, these products are still frequently being promoted with impermissible claims, which is really the main area of concern for the FDA as well as the FTC for these products. These agencies have repeatedly issued warning letters. They've brought enforcement actions against merchants marketing products with problematic claims. And they don't just focus on claims about chronic or life-threatening diseases here like cancer, but also less blatantly problematic diseases, such as claims to treat ailments like inflammation or pain or insomnia. The FDA is just as willing to go after products making claims to treat those. And as noted, state laws can be complex, they can be poorly written or poorly implemented, and they're also just rapidly changing as the states try to play catch up. Some states like Oregon and Kentucky, they can be fairly lax about CBD sales in their borders, but other states such as Idaho continue to take a fairly strong stance. So if you come across a CBD merchant that's selling to all 50 states, you want to approach them very cautiously. And then lastly, a big concern for financial regulators seems to be ensuring that the underlying hemp product is cultivated pursuant to the USDA requirements. So this can be a little tricky to ascertain. There's a number of ways that hemp can legally be cultivated. Under the 2018 Farm Bill, it can be grown based either on a state plan that's been approved by the USDA or in a state that does not have a USDA approved plan and doesn't plan to have a USDA approved plan. The grower can be licensed directly by the USDA, and as long as they follow USDA rules. One last thing to note is that the 2014 Farm Bill, it has a limited provision that allows states to develop hemp cultivation pilot programs for research purposes. Under these programs, growers were still mostly required to be licensed by their state Department of Agriculture, but they don't have to follow the more stringent requirements of the 2018 Farm Bill. But this provision is still technically in effect until October, but it will then be phased out after that. But there are still plenty of states that are basically allowing the cultivation of hemp under these rules. So there's been a lot of interesting regulatory changes over the last year or so. Most recently, just this last Friday, the DEA issued a new rule implementing the 2018 Farm Bill. This rule really did a number of things. So when Epidiolex was first approved by the FDA, all cannabis-derived CBD was pretty much considered a Schedule I controlled substance. And this resulted in the DEA creating a new entry in its schedules for FDA-approved forms of CBD. This was in Schedule 5, which is the least restrictive schedule. The new rule basically undoes that. It states that FDA-approved forms of CBD are no longer controlled substances and don't fall under the purview of the Controlled Substances Act. More interesting, the rule reverses the DEA's previous position on marijuana extracts. So for a long while, the DEA maintained that CBD derived from marijuana was also considered marijuana, even if it contained less than 0.3% delta-9 THC. This rule changes course on that, clarifying that in order for a cannabis extract to be classified as marijuana, it has to contain more than 0.3% THC. Lastly, another thing the rule does, it clarifies that any material containing more than 0.3% THC is considered marijuana. And this seems fairly uncontroversial at first, but it has caused waves in the hemp industry. And this is because the cannabinoid extraction process almost always results in levels of delta-9 THC above 0.3% at some point in the process. So processors would basically end up possessing Schedule I controlled substances under this law, even if the end product was then diluted back down to 0.3 or below. So a literal reading of this rule seems to basically effectively criminalize a lot of the current extraction process. So it's likely that this will be clarified when the rule is completely finalized and once the agency reviews rulemaking comments, but until then, it might chill the industry a little bit. Congress has basically been floating around a bill called the Safe Banking Act. This has been floating around for a little over a year, I believe. It's basically a bipartisan bill. It was passed in the House and it's just kind of been sitting with the Senate. It would basically allow banks to service state legal cannabis businesses, even if marijuana remains legal federally. So in short, it would open the door for the payments and banking industries to provide recreational and medical marijuana dispensaries that are otherwise compliant with the law in their respective states. Another thing it would do is that it would require federal regulators to provide additional guidance, confirming the legality of providing financial services to hemp businesses. And that last bit might not even really be necessary at this point. Multiple financial regulators have issued guidances on servicing hemp businesses. Most recently, in June 2020, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they issued a guidance for financial institutions seeking to provide financial services to hemp-based businesses. And this guidance basically, it focuses heavily on services to hemp growers. So it's a bit unclear whether or how it actually applies to businesses selling or manufacturing hemp-derived products. In short, it basically maintains that institutions must establish risk-based procedures when assessing their BSA or AML compliance. So standard SAR procedures apply, but you should note that the guidance says that cultivation of hemp alone does not trigger the SAR requirements. However, things like cultivating hemp in states where it's not allowed or being unable to demonstrate licensure might trigger those requirements. And the guidance emphasizes that as part of a due diligence program, financial institutions will want to assess hemp growers' compliance by obtaining a number of items, such as written attestations that they're licensed, copies of those licenses. They'll want testing reports. They'll want to make sure that the license is continually renewed. They'll want their attestations to be updated as necessary. And they'll want to look at any correspondence with the state, tribal government, or the USDA, or whoever is governing the cultivation of that hemp. And lastly, there's a couple promising glimmers for folks who are hoping for CBD to someday be allowed in dietary supplements. First off is a bill in the House that's basically hasn't done much at this point, but basically would do just that. It would explicitly permit CBD to be sold as a dietary supplement, regardless of its use in pharmaceutical products. As I said, this hasn't moved forward too much, but it has potential to do so. Probably more exciting on this front and more potentially promising, there's a document that the FDA recently submitted to the Office of Management and Budget for regulatory review. There's no actual details on what is actually in this document, but most industry players at this point assume that it could be the FDA ostensibly announcing that it will not be taking action against otherwise compliant CBD dietary supplements. And it might set a limit for the amount of permissible CBD in supplements. On the other hand, the FDA has not been particularly friendly towards CBD. They've continually cited safety risks, so it's possible that this document could signal an even more aggressive enforcement approach. The document's under review, but that review could feasibly be finished at any time. So with all that said, I guess the question is, how does this apply to payments? Card brands basically approach CBD just like most other products. They follow the buyer-seller jurisdiction rule. They require the product to be compliant in both the buyer and the seller's jurisdiction. But due to the uncertainty in the market and the regulations, most payment service providers have been really unwilling to take a headfirst plunge into this market. And that hesitancy might be warranted. There's a number of issues in this market. Last year, LegitScript, we conducted a compliance survey of the CBD market to determine how many people were following the rules and what other risks were present in the sector. We found that nearly 98% of online CBD merchants were operating out of compliance. And we basically measured that based on the type of products sold, the jurisdictions they were shipping to, and the marketing claims that they were making. And this non-compliance manifests in a number of ways. For example, we tested roughly 30 CBD products and found that 2/3 had significant deviations in potency from what was on the label. One product had high lead levels, and others contained high amounts of carcinogenic solvents. And the potency concerns, those really went both ways. Some products contained hardly any CBD at all, where others contained double the amount that they claimed. So it was kind of all over the map there. And the products themselves aren't really the only concerning aspects. The merchant accounts also presented high-risk behavior. Our financial investigations team looked into the payments we made via credit card, and we discovered that at least one merchant showed likely indicators of transaction laundering. And this is something that we've seen before in the CBD space and our monitoring for our payments clients. Many of these CBD sellers appear to use offshore payment processing, and in our investigation, 8 of our transactions had unexpected cross-border transaction fees. We researched these and found that 5 of them appeared to be transacting through known high-risk payment processors that provide services on behalf of merchants operating in other high-risk or illicit sectors such as gambling, financial trading platforms, illegal pharmaceutical sales, and marijuana sales. Other high-risk behavior we observed during our survey included multi-level marketing operations offering CBD, which in and of themselves aren't necessarily problematic, but they can easily tip over into pyramid scheme territory, which will trigger FTC scrutiny. Over 30 were using affiliate marketing programs, which again is not in and of itself problematic, but just heightens the risk for problematic claims. And then there were multiple that had subscription programs with indicators of negative option billing, which is basically an approach to ensnare consumers in ongoing subscriptions without their consent. So a couple tips for CBD onboarding. You want to require lab testing of the products just to ensure their quality and their safety. Frequently requiring new tests is a good idea just to avoid old results. Having the certificates of analysis sent directly to you from the lab to avoid fudging of numbers, and also requiring supply chain documentation to make sure that the product is compliant all the way from the beginning of cultivation to the end product. Investigating business affiliations. This includes requiring transparency in business and domain name registrations. You also want to look for connection to other problematic products such as marijuana or kratom. We find these products often sold together. You also want to search for prior discipline issues just to give you another factor to look at when you're assessing whether a merchant has an eye towards compliance. Third, you really want to watch closely for disease claims. I've hammered on this, but the FDA and FTC have repeatedly said that this is a major concern for them. And you don't want to just look at the product label. You want to look at product descriptions. You want to look at articles and testimonials posted on the website, social media, website URLs, meta tags, citations to published studies. These are all things that the FDA and FTC have looked at for problematic claims. And then lastly, working with a third party to streamline the onboarding of your CBD merchants, people who have an eye towards following the trends and understand the space can be really helpful to just streamline the process for you. So if you have any questions about CBD, you can reach out to us. We're always happy to talk about CBD or other products as well. Yeah, I think we have about 5 minutes. I'll go ahead and take questions now. Hold on one second. Let me pull this up. All right. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Hold on one second. So we've got a question. Are there reliable ways to measure the 0.03% THC in the field? I'm not quite, there are definitely clear standards, I think, in the USDA requirements. I can't quite remember what those are. And I think basically though, it requires, sending it to a certified lab and, waiting for that. I don't think there's an actual in the field way of verifying that. What about CBD animal products? So CBD animal products basically, the FDA considers animal products to either be food or drugs. There's no such thing as a dietary supplement animal product. So basically, it either has to be an FDA approved drug, or it has to be a food. And animal foods are basically subject to the same requirements as human foods. So CBD can't be used in those. We have another question: do financial services companies still have to file an SARs for each cannabis transaction? I believe for marijuana, the FinCEN 2014 guidance still applies. If there's a hemp business that is also doing cannabis transactions, basically they can either, if they keep those business lines separate, then they don't have to file it for the hemp parts of their business, but they still have to do it for each marijuana transaction. How confident are you in safe harbor legislation forthcoming in 1 to 2 years, state or federal, based on regulatory consideration? I feel fairly confident that the FDA is going to come forward at some point in the next year or two with some sort of safe harbor legislation for dietary supplements. But what that will look like is kind of questionable. I have definitely heard that they're going to basically have some sort of limits for the amount of THC, the amount of CBD. So it'll be basically something around naturally occurring levels of CBD. You can't have high levels because then you're getting into the same sort of concentration that would appear in a drug. What if the animal product is manufactured in an FDA-approved facility? Generally, that still doesn't, that's getting more towards regulatory compliance, but still ultimately the issue there is that the animal product is not a product that is permitted under the law. You could potentially have topical animal products, but that's also a fairly fuzzy area because there's, again, no such thing as animal cosmetics. And I feel like a lot of topical products are basically claiming to be cosmetics. So the issue with animal products really is that there's not as many potential product classifications that they could fall into. And under FDA law, it's basically either a food or a drug. So even if it's being manufactured in an FDA registered facility, it's still not going to get to the point where the underlying product is actually a product that is compliant with FDA law. All right, well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the morning, and I appreciate being here. Thank you.